Greetings all, welcome to another session here of Tuzi Talks. Today we're going to be focusing on this new text entitled Mastering ESL and Bilingual Methods. This is by Herrera and Murray. If you're interested, you can go out to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and go pick up a copy. Today we're going to be focusing on two sections here. One is on the cognitive issues or cognitive dimensions, and also the academic dimensions for our second language learners, for our cognitively and linguistically diverse students. So that's what we're going to be working at today. Let's jump right in here and look at a little brief overview of how everything's going to be. We're going to be focusing on some of the challenges that these students are going to have, both cognitive challenges and academic challenges. We'll also look at some of the processes they're going to have to be going through and that they'll have to deal with, and some implications for you as teachers and possibly even you as students. Let's jump right into some of the cognitive challenges that students learning a second language in a second culture are going to have to deal with. So one of the things they're going to have to deal with is the fact that their first language may be partially developed, not completely developed. You may have students who are coming into your classroom and they don't know their first language completely. You may have students who come in, they don't know how to read in their language. That's going to present a challenge to them as they're trying to learn a second language. And so that might be an issue. If you're dealing with kids that are really young, 2, 3 years old, my thought is that this text is probably not for you. This series is not for you. You can simply begin these kids as if they were bilingual. You get beyond 3, 4, now you can start playing with some of these issues with regard to partial development. Bear in mind that they can communicate a little bit of that by that time. If they're older, you may have kids 12, 13, 14 years old who can fully communicate, and their language development is complete, except that they can't read. They don't know how to communicate in written form in their own language, and so therefore they're also going to have this problem of L1 development issues. They're going to be in your class trying to learn English, trying to learn to read in English, but they have no background in that information at all with which to try to understand this second language. The other problem you're going to have is something that's called a reductionist curriculum. This type of thing is not necessarily well, some will say it's a bad thing. Some will say it's a necessary thing. But for your second language learners, it's much more difficult to understand what's going on. Students who grow up in the first language and they've learned and read and understand, and they're now moving along in their classes, have a lot of understanding of information that requires little cues or nonverbals or hints. They simply understand it because they have understood the things that are going on in the culture. For someone who doesn't have that background, doesn't have that solid depth of understanding within the language, a reductionist curriculum is going to be more difficult for them. The example I could think of would be Shakespeare, looking at something in Shakespeare and say, a rose by any other name. And you may understand what I mean by that simply because I make that phrase, a rose by any other name. Or I say tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Well, if you don't have the background, okay, that quote is not going to make any sense. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, there was a poem that we had to read entitled Out, Out. And it was a reference to Shakespeare about Lady Macbeth and her trying to get the spot of blood out of her hand. If you didn't understand where that reference came from when you read the poem, you wouldn't understand the context. Now, we do this, okay, we have difficulty sometimes doing this as native speakers. A second language learner, there are so many cues and so many nuances and so many things that are simply understood that if your second language learner doesn't have that ability, everything is reduced. Now, what happens in the curriculum is that the curriculum content is reduced. And everything is being reduced to what? Standardized tests. Where there's a lot of information that's being abstracted out or being eliminated, and if you've got to figure it out, you have to have that information when you walk in. And if you don't have that, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So a reductionist curriculum is actually designed to help the native speaker move along more quickly because they have that base. You don't have that base, you're in a lot more trouble. So a reductionist curriculum for the second language learner is bad news. Of course, the two options are, one, don't use it. Try to avoid using a reductionist curriculum. Two, provide scaffolding for those who need it. And the other option, of course, is train your students to survive in that curriculum. I don't know what the future holds for curriculum, but from what I see, we're having more tests and more assessments and more analysis, and that lends itself to more of a reductionist curriculum. It would be better if you provide that scaffolding, you provide that rich content environment for your students to understand, but you may not be able to. And in that case, you're going to have to try and circumvent that by providing supports for your language learners. The other challenge that they might have cognitively is that they only have the ability to interpret or to do hypothesis testing in their first language. So students who are coming in, they're trying to learn a second language, and they're trying to do this in an academic setting, in a grammar school or elementary, high school setting. Their ability to interpret what's going on, they may not have those skills, those cues, those strategies in the second language. They only have it in the first language, in which case it's going to be harder for them to interpret. It's going to be harder for them to kind of take a guess, do some hypothesis testing. Maybe this is what this means. Okay. Cummins' theoretical framework looks something like this, where you have these two axes, where you have something that's a little less demanding, cognitively demanding up here, something that's very demanding, and stuff that is context reduced versus stuff that is context embedded. Now, the ideal situation is going to be somewhere in the A area. That's going to be the easier stuff because it's less demanding and it's context embedded. The more difficult one is going to be down here at the D level because it's context reduced and it's cognitively demanding, something that's going to require you to think and have more abstract ideas, and also is going to have less context. You can find activities in all four of these areas, but of course the ideal is going to be, to at least initially, is going to be in this range, and move down and then move across more slowly, and not move to the D region so quickly. We as first language users, we don't have much of a problem with declarative knowledge, but there are times where we have difficulty with procedural knowledge. Trying to tell someone how to drive a car, for example, we do this sometimes without thinking, and so we have to stop and think, okay, what's the first step? What's the second step? Okay, we've taken things and made them automatic processes in our mind, and when we try to be able to say them again, we have to slow down and think and retrace our steps in order to be able to articulate what that means. Even in talking about what you're thinking or how you think or how you feel, there are some people who have more difficulty with that. It would be good for you as a teacher to not only be teaching language and teaching content, and providing opportunities for them to practice in this constructivist literacy theory development that Herrera and Murray are focusing on. But it's also good to teach strategies. Teach them ways in which they can improve their own language learning. Research does indicate that people who use a variety of strategies for learning language succeed more quickly and further along than do people who only use one or two strategies. Additionally, there are probably students that you may have who don't even realize that they need or should or can have a strategy. So it's good for you to focus on strategies. In fact, there is a whole methodology out there for teaching language through teaching strategies. And so you may want to go investigate some of these strategies that will help students learn language better, more efficiently. Just a quick note on one strategy that I use often, and it's called circumlocution. It's where you're having a conversation, you're talking and talking and talking, and all of a sudden you meet a barrier. You meet a word or a phrase or an idea, and you don't know how to communicate that idea. And so you try to find ways to describe it, to give examples of it. You talk around it so that you can continue the conversation. Or you talk around it and then someone tells you what the word is, and then you can just go right through and get that word. The example that I remember is going to the bank. when I was living overseas in Japan. I walked in there, I needed to open up an account. So I walk in, and the lady there says, how can I help you? And I'm like, yes, I'd like to, and I don't know the word for account. So I'm sitting there going, I'd like to put money in the bank. Those words I knew. And she looked at me and she says, oh, you'd like to open an account? And I said, yes, I want to open an account. And I learned that new word because I talked around it. Okay, that was a strategy that I learned as I was learning language. Now, there's a strategy you can teach your students, to have them talk around something. If they're shy, of course, it's going to be a bit more difficult, but that's just one strategy that you can use. And like I say, there are a couple dozen that I know of strategies for, and again, they can be broken down into these areas: social, metacognitive, and linguistic strategies that you can teach your students. My thought is, if you're going to be teaching, once a week, a couple times a week even, bring out a strategy. Let them focus on what that strategy is and try to get them to practice with it so that they can become more efficient at learning a second language. Also going to be helpful in having them master and play with the different types of knowledge bases that they have here, the declarative and the procedural. Some implications of the cognitive challenges and the cognitive processes that second language learners are going to have to grapple with, implications for you as teachers, is for you to complete a needs analysis. And when I say a needs analysis, find out what your students know, find out what they don't know, find out what they're interested in, find out what information they already have. Get to know who they are so you can find out what their needs are. What do they want to do with this information? Why do they want to learn this language? How far do they want to go in their schooling? What is it that they're trying to do? If you get to know who they are, get to know their background, their wants, their dreams, you can more appropriately help them move along in their language mastery. So you should do a needs analysis. Find out what they need linguistically, socially, what their goals and expectations are, what their parents' goals and expectations are if they're young little tots. But do a needs analysis. The other thing I strongly recommend is that you continue to do formative assessments. Continue to ask them if they know something. You're going to start a new series on, swimming or geography or, the history of whatever. And you ask them, have they studied this before? Have they had this before? Is there something similar in their culture? Okay, to help them connect to this new information and to provide you an opportunity to give them added support if they don't have sufficient background. The only way you're going to do that is to constantly be asking questions, doing little interviews with them, having little conversations with them to keep abreast of what they know and what they don't know. This will allow you to modify your curriculum, modify your teaching to provide for their needs. And again, if they have sufficient scaffolding already, you don't need to worry about it. Okay. This also means that you as a teacher, you're constantly fluctuating to meet the needs of your students. Okay. Additionally, strike a balance between the cognitive demands that they're going to have and understanding. Now, this all goes back to what I would look at as Krashen's idea of the affective filter. I don't want to make it so difficult that they don't want to study, they don't want to learn, they're scared, they're frustrated. I don't want to make it so easy that they're not challenged. They should be challenged, especially if they're learning a second language. It is a formidable task. And so they should be challenged, but we don't want to make it so challenging that they lose hope, they lose zeal to want to continue studying. You want to strike a balance there as you're doing this. Strike a balance with the amount of support that you provide them as well. You want to give them some support so that they can succeed, but you don't want to smother them. You want to pull back if you notice that, okay? And that to me is one of the biggest words a teacher should have as a second language teacher, someone who's dealing with students who are bilingual, bicultural, is that you want to keep an eye on them. You want to be able to step in when they need it, and step back so that they can have that feeling of independence and freedom at the same time. That way you can try to encourage them to take ownership over their language learning. These are some of the